I'm Ian, I'm the chair of the Friends of the Marden Valley. Particular thanks this evening to Susan Baker, who's organised this session. I think many of you, including me, have been on a journey over the past few weeks. We've had bird zooms and fish zooms, and we've had tree zooms, and tonight we're having what us amateurs are describing as an insect zoom. And I'm delighted that we've got Mike Garratt from the University of Reading, although he lives slightly close to us in sunny Swindon. Mike is going to talk to us about a range of subjects, from crop pollination to busting some myths around pollinators, and then finishing off with what we can all do to try and encourage and support our pollinators in our various communities and so forth. So without further ado, welcome to everybody this evening, but particular welcome to Mike, and we'll take questions, if we may, after Mike's presentation, but welcome, Mike.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction, Ian. And yeah, thanks for having me. So what I'll do is I'll share screen now. If you could confirm that my presentation has come up okay, please. That would be great, just so I know it's working. How's that?
That looks good, Mike. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you very much for having me. Yeah. Yeah, that's what I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk about bees and other pollinators and the crucial role they play and how we can help protect them. So pollinators. Then I'm sure you're all familiar with this bee. This is the honeybee. Of course, a really important pollinator. Not only because it produces this stuff, which we all enjoy, but of course it's a really important pollinator of flowering plants as well. But importantly, honeybees are not the only pollinator that are out there. You may also be familiar with this pollinator. This is a bumblebee, quite distinctive. They're often large, hairy bees, and you'll often hear them coming before you see them. So bumblebees. So they're actually quite a diverse group. We've got 25 species of bumblebee in the UK. But again, bumblebees are not the only bee. There's actually very many more bee species, and there's a real diversity of different bees in the UK. Leafcutter bees, mining bees, mason bees, and they all have different ecologies and different biologies and have different roles in the ecosystem. And actually, currently, I think there's 229 bee species in the UK. But actually, the honeybee is the only one that produces honey and the only one we farm for honey. So why should we care about these other bee species? Why are they important? Well, here you can see a nice picture taken by a colleague of mine, Sean, of a andrenid bee. Now, this is a mining bee, and it's landed on an apple flower. So at the University of Reading, we've done, as Ian said, we're interested in crop pollination, particularly, and we've done a lot of work on apple pollination. And here you can see a mining bee that's landed on an apple blossom. And it's done this in order to collect nectar to feed itself and pollen to feed its young. So these bees, they nest in holes in the ground, and that's where they lay their eggs. And they collect pollen from flowers, and they take that pollen back to the nest for their larvae to feed on for the next generation of these bees. And it lands on this flower to collect that nectar and pollen. But actually, as it moves around that apple orchard, as it moves from apple blossom to apple blossom, it deposits pollen on those apple flowers, and this carries out reproduction for the apple tree. Now, this is really important because it needs that pollination in order for these apple trees to set fruit and produce apples, which of course is important for the farmer, but also important for us as consumers of apples as well. So this pollination service is a really important thing that's delivered by these wild bees. But amazingly, 75% of crop species, about 3/4 of all crop species grown around the world, depend to some extent on animals for pollination. And it's not just bees, there's very many other animal pollinators of these crops and other plants. But 75% of them depend to some extent on pollination in order to produce a crop and produce yield. And it's particularly those fruits and vegetables that are really dependent on pollination, those crops that support a kind of a healthy, balanced diet. So they're providing a really important service. But if you're not that fussed about getting your sort of 5 fruit and veg a day, well, coffee and cocoa are also insect pollinated crops. So without insects pollinating these crops, we wouldn't have chocolate and coffee. And if that isn't a reason to protect pollinators, I don't know what is. And the current estimates of the kind of global value of this pollination by insects, somewhere between kind of $200 and $600 billion per annum. I mean, it's an astronomical amount, the estimated contribution of these important insects and other animals to pollinating our crops. So I guess, what does all this important pollination? And we've talked about bees in particular, the honeybee, those other wild bee species, but there's very many other insects and animals that visit flowers to feed on nectar, to feed on pollen, and then do that pollination of crops and other plants. So flies, beetles, butterflies, but even in the tropics, some birds, mammals, and reptiles are even pollinators of plant species, predominantly wild plant species, not so much crops. And actually, there's a number of groups of pollinators, species of pollinators that are not wild and are actually managed for the pollination services they can provide to crops. So the honeybee, of course, we know is used to pollinate crops, but also some bumblebee species are now reared to pollinate crops, as well as some other solitary bee, particularly the mason bees, are now used to pollinate crops. So this diversity of flower visiting animals is really important in supporting crop production around the world. But it crops up in the news quite a lot. I mean, bees are a kind of popular subject, and it crops up in the news that there may be some pollinator crisis or bees are in decline. I mean, it captures the media's imagination a lot, and we see the headlines. So I guess, what is the evidence? What do we know about the pollinator crisis and whether bees really are in decline? Well, actually, we know there's a number of threats facing bees and other pollinators. These include land use change. So this is a really important thing that's happening all over the world, in the UK and elsewhere. And that's land is changing, particularly for urbanization and agriculture. So in a lot of areas, natural and semi-natural habitats are being cleared to support ever-expanding agricultural food production. And this kind of change in land use has been shown to have a really negative effect on lots of biodiversity, lots of wildlife, but particularly bees and other pollinators. And actually, if you go to areas where natural habitat has been removed, you'll find less bees and fewer bee species, and less pollinators and fewer pollinator species. So this land use change is a real threat facing pollinators. But there's also a number of diseases as well, potentially affecting bees and other pollinators. If you keep bees, honeybees, I'm sure you'll be aware of the varroa mite. And this is a real pest of honeybees, and it spreads a number of viruses, which can have really negative effects on honeybees. And in certain parts of the world, it's made keeping honeybees much more difficult, and overwintering survival is reduced. And there's actually emerging evidence now that some of these diseases can be transmitted between honeybees and wild bees when they share flowers and when they forage in the same environment. So that's a threat facing pollinators. Chemicals, I guess broadly speaking, but things like pesticides and other agrochemicals, there's evidence that these things can have a negative effect on bees and other pollinators, and they're a threat in certain situations. Climate change, of course, is a challenge facing all of us, and it's going to have continued unpredictable effects into the future. But bees and other pollinators are no exception. Climate change is likely to put a real pressure on bees and pollinators as well. In fact, there's recent evidence has shown that bumblebees, for example, are a really important group of bees and pollinators, and actually across Europe, the ranges, so that's the area in which you find different bumblebee species, are getting less. As summers are getting warmer and temperatures are rising, bumblebees are actually cold adapted species. That's why they're big and they're hairy, and actually get more bumblebee species in kind of high north and southern latitudes. because they're cold adapted species. And so these changing climatic conditions, particularly increasing in temperatures, are not doing bumblebees very well at all. So across Europe, some species, their ranges are declining significantly, which of course is a serious issue, not only for the bumblebees, but for the important pollination that they do as well. And invasive species. So with globalization, and transport of people and products and crops around the world, invasive species have become a major ecological issue affecting lots of parts of the world. And again, bees and pollinators are no exception. So some bumblebees, like Bombus terrestris, the buff-tailed bumblebee, is a common bumblebee. We have it in the UK. It's an important pollinator here, but actually it's now produced commercially, and you can buy it in colonies, and it's produced commercially to put in crops and carry out pollination to maximize crop yield. And actually these Bombus terrestris have been transported around the world for pollination, and now actually they've established themselves in their non-native ranges like in South America, and they're displacing native species of bumblebee, presenting a real threat to them. But in reality, it's no one factor that threatens pollinators. It's actually a combination of these factors, and in different regions and in different contexts, different factors become a problem. But bring it back to the UK then. So what evidence do we have that potentially there is maybe pollinators are declining? So this is a graph taken from a recent study carried out by a team at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and it shows the occupancy of bees and hoverflies, which are another really important group of pollinators in the UK, and how this has changed over the last 30 or 40 years. Now, these data are based on historical records collected by volunteers and amateur entomologists around the UK, but that provides a really valuable data source to allow us to look at how trends in pollinators, hoverflies and bees have changed over time. And here you can see the occupancy, which is effectively the area in which you find different species of bees and hoverflies, has declined overall for bees and hoverflies over this period of time. There's been a steady decline. So the range, the area in which you find different species has gone down. Some species have actually done well, and their numbers are increasing over recent years, but actually for the average and for the majority of species, there's been a decline over this period of time. So if you're, that's a bit of a kind of an overview of pollinators, how important they are, the kind of evidence around how well they're doing at the moment. But if you're really interested in pollinators, I'd recommend this report. It's basically put together by an international team of scientists, and it gathers all the evidence on bees and pollinators, what we know and what we don't know about their important role in ecosystems and in supporting food production around the world. So if you're interested, that's got a lot of really interesting information in it, and the kind of current facts and figures on pollinators and pollination. So now I wanted to talk about some of the research projects we've been doing more recently at the University of Reading. And actually, I joined the University of Reading as a postdoc. So I'd finished my PhD, and I did a couple of other jobs, and then I joined Reading as a postdoc. And my first job at Reading was to join a project, the Insect Pollinators Initiative. And this project was specifically looking at crop pollination in the UK. So there was an idea that maybe pollinators are in decline. There's an understanding that these pollinators, bees and other pollinators, are really important for pollinating our crops and producing the crops we eat. But we didn't really understand a lot about crop pollination in the UK. So I joined the University of Reading on this project, and we had a number of research questions that we set out to try and answer. We wanted to understand, well, who are the most important pollinators in UK crops? Is it honeybees? Is it wild bees? Is it flies? And we also wanted to know what contribution they're actually making to production. We've heard, 75% of crop types growing around the world depend to some extent on pollinators, but what contribution do they actually make to growing these crops, to the yield and to the quality? And then we also wanted to investigate how we might particularly with crop pollination, how we might work with farmers and work on farmland, and how we might protect pollinators and pollination so that they can continue to deliver this really important service of pollination to our crops. So the first question we set out to ask was who are the main pollinators of crops in the UK? And for this, we worked on 4 crops up and down the country. We had a team of researchers, and we went out and we surveyed pollinators in these different crops. So the crops we worked on, you'll be familiar with all of them: strawberries, apples, field beans, which are broad beans, oilseed rape. Now, all these crops are really important crops that we produce in this country, important food crops, and they all depend to some extent on insect pollinators. And to try and better understand what's pollinating these crops, we carried out lots of different surveys in these crops. And here you can see me wandering through an apple orchard, catching insects that are visiting apple blossoms to find out what's there visiting these flowers. But we also used other techniques. This is a pan trap, it's called, and these are just a simple plastic dishes that you spray with a UV reflective paint, and they attract in insects that might visit flowers. And then you can come back the following day, collect them up, take them to the laboratory for identification. But these pan traps are really great because they give you a good idea of the abundance, so how many pollinators are around and what different species are around as well. And we carried out crop watches, we called them as well. So this is a colleague of mine, Duncan, who was working on this project, and he's standing in a field of field beans. And what we did for this method, we marked out an area of field bean crop. We then counted all the flowers in that area, and then we watched it for a period of time, and we recorded every visit made to flowers by different insects. It was our least popular survey technique, I'll have to confess, because it can be quite tedious, particularly on a day when there's not much happening with the pollinators. But it's really useful in providing an idea of the different kinds of pollinators that are visiting a crop and potentially pollinating it. So what do we find from our surveys then? Well, this is some data showing the percentage of visits to apple flowers that we observed on our surveys. And these are visits made by some important groups of pollinators, the bumblebees, the honeybee, of course, other bees, so other predominantly solitary bees, and hoverflies, as well as other insects like butterflies and flies and beetles. And as you can see, and if you go into an apple orchard, you'll see a real diversity of different insects landing on apple flowers, collecting pollen, collecting nectar. We found this when we did our surveys, and we see different species of these different groups of pollinators visiting apple blossoms. But if you go into your bean field and do a pollinator survey like Duncan was in the previous slide, actually the vast majority of insects you see visiting bean flowers will be bumblebees. And I'll touch on why that is in a minute. And then in strawberry fields, we carried out surveys too, and we see a different situation here. It's mostly bumblebees and honeybees visiting strawberry flowers. And then finally, in oilseed rape, actually in oilseed rape, you see a real diversity of different insects. And so when they're in flower in spring, you'll see them, the yellow fields. If you take a look at an oilseed rape field, you'll see all sorts on the flowers. You'll see small beetles like pollen beetles. You'll see loads of different fly species landing on oilseed rape. But you'll also see bumblebees and your solitary bees and honeybees visiting oilseed rape for the nectar and the pollen. But here we found, a good number of those other kinds of pollinators in oilseed rape. So this, if nothing else, helps us start to build a picture of the different pollinators pollinating different crops and how it's really different between different crops as well. But it's not just about the number of insects you see in a field visiting flowers. It's also about how good they are as pollinators as well. So this is actually a bean flower, as you'd see it growing in a field of beans. And here you can see it being visited by a bumblebee. And this bumblebee, in order to get the nectar from the bean flower, it forces its way into the flower and has to access the nectar at the bottom of the corolla, which is the neck of the flower. And when it does this, it comes into contact with the anther and the stigma. So the anther is where the pollen's produced, and the stigma is where the pollen needs to be. And it increases the chance that flower will get pollinated, and it increases the chance that bean flower will turn into beans, which of course is what the farmer's looking for and what we're looking for as well as people who eat beans. But we observed some other interesting behavior while we're doing our survey. So here you can see a bumblebee that's landed on a bean flower. But instead of going into the front of the flower to collect that nectar at the base of the flower, it actually sneaks around the back of the flower and nibbles a small hole at the base of the flower and pinches nectar straight out at the bottom of the hole. So it gets its sugary treat, but doesn't actually increase pollination of that flower. So we've got a champion pollinator in the first slide, but a sneaky cheat pollinator in this slide. And here we can see a bumblebee, cheekier still, the honeybee, sorry, you can see a honeybee, and cheekier still, it will follow the bumblebee round and use the holes made by the bumblebee to access nectar from the base of the flower. Because actually the mandibles, so the jaws of the honeybee, aren't strong enough to nibble holes in the base of the bean flower, but they'll use holes already made by the bumblebees. So it's not just about how many bees there are, it's about how many pollinators there are visiting crops. It's about how effective they are as pollinators when they land as well. So this is the thing we wanted to test next in some of our research. So at the University of Reading, we built flight cages. And these were about 2.5 meters tall, mesh cages, and they were great because they allowed us to manipulate pollinators. So to put different pollinators inside the cages with different crops to really try and understand how important they were at pollinating those crops. So here you can see Rebecca, another one of our team, and she's watering hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of strawberry plants there, ready for our experiments. And when we went in these cages, so we used to go in there to carry out our observations with honeybees and bumblebees and hoverflies. We often wore beekeeper suits as well to avoid getting stung too much, although they weren't too bad generally. But in these flight cages, we had a number of different pollinator species that we were working with. The red mason bee, which is a really important and common solitary bee that we find in this country. Bombus terrestris, probably our most common bumblebee. The marmalade hoverfly we had in our flight cages as well. And of course, Apis mellifera, the honeybee. And so we grew our crops and we put them into these cages with our different pollinators. And we then went to the crops at the end of the season. We measured the yield when they'd been pollinated by different insects. So we measured how much crop those crop plants were producing after being pollinated by different pollinators. And this is some data from our bean plants. And it shows the number of beans that we got on those plants when they were visited by different pollinators. And we found that our bumblebee and our mason bee were really good bean pollinators. And we've looked at the bean flower, and you've got to be a nice, big, robust, strong pollinator to pollinate a bean flower. And we found that our bumblebees and our solitary bees were those kind of bees, those pollinators. Then for our oilseed rape, here we found that actually all of our pollinators were pretty good at pollinating oilseed rape. Once they've landed on an oilseed rape flower, then you get good seed set and good yield from that crop. Hoverflies were a bit worse than the other pollinators generally, but they're all pretty good. And if you look at an oilseed rape flower, it's nice and open, and you can see the stigmas and the anthers, and the nectar's nice and accessible. So lots of different insects will use them to collect nectar, and actually lots of different insects will then be able to pollinate those flowers as well. So we start to understand how abundant, so how many different pollinators there are in different crop fields, and we also start to build a picture of how effective different pollinators are, and we can start to understand which pollinators are really contributing to the pollinators of our different crops. So our next research question then was, okay, we've been out there, we've seen what's pollinating our crops. How important are they actually? And what contribution are they making to producing the yield from these crops? How important are they for producing apples, producing oil from oilseed rape crops, producing beans? And you can actually test this using experiments in the field. And we did this. And you do this by excluding pollinators. You stop bees and other pollinators from visiting flowers during the spring so that they can't visit those flowers and they can't pollinate those flowers. And you then go back at the end of the season and you compare the pollination that's happened when you've stopped insects visiting those flowers, and you compare it with the crop the yield that the crop has produced when it has been visited by insects and pollinators. So you make that comparison, and here you can see Cassie, another of our field team, visiting one of our orchards, and we put bags on branches, and we had branches which were open to and insects could visit those flowers, and we compared the number of apples on those trees and the quality of apples on those trees that had been produced when they were pollinated by insects or when they weren't. And what we found was quite interesting. I mean, here you'll see some data for 4 varieties of apple. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. You can buy these varieties of apple in most supermarkets. So Cox, Gala, Braeburn, of course, Bramley apples as well. And this graph shows the economic contribution that insect pollinators are making to these different varieties of apples. and it shows the pounds per hectare that the farmer gets for these different apple varieties when they're pollinated by insects or when they're not. So the yellow shows the economic output, so how much the farmer can make from a crop when there's no insects pollinating it, and then the green bars are the additional added value that pollinators provide to these crops. So pollinators visiting apples are making a really important economic contribution to pollination. And without them, yields would be much less, quality would be much less, and the economic output from these crops would be much less. And then we took this research a stage further, and we wanted to try and understand, well, what contribution are different pollinators making to the production of apples? It's important to know this because if we want to manage pollinators in crops, it's really important to know which of those champion pollinators of apples, which ones should we be trying to manage and support so that they'll pollinate those crops. So if you combine the abundance and the effectiveness of different pollinators, as well as the economic contribution they're making to pollination, and look, you can actually calculate the contribution that different insects are making to production of apples. And so we did this, and we found that these solitary bees, these wild bees, particularly ground nesting andrenid bees, so mining bees, were really important pollinators in apples, making the biggest economic contribution to production. Honeybees, bumblebees, and hoverflies as well were making an important contribution to pollination, but these ground nesting bees were really, really key. So in order to maintain pollination, perhaps if bees are declining and we want to protect them and make sure we've got enough bees and other pollinators in farmed landscapes to pollinate our crops, what can we do to try and protect and help pollinators so that they can continue to do this crop pollination? Well, firstly, bees and other pollinators need a place to nest. And for these ground nesting bees, it's often undisturbed bare ground where we find these andrenid bees nesting. Here's one now emerging from one of its burrows. And of course, they need food to eat as well. So that's pollen and nectar. And that's pollen and nectar provided not just by the crop, which is usually only in flower for a few weeks, like apples, or only in blossom for a couple of weeks. It's food, pollen and nectar that's available to them throughout the whole season. So that's having flowering plants around before the crop is in flower and after the crop is in flower to support those populations of wild bees so they can do that really great pollination. So we did another study as part of a large-scale European project, the Liberation Project, and we were looking at protecting pollinators in agricultural areas so they could do that crop pollination. So here you can see an aerial photo of a pretty typical, I guess, quite intensive agricultural landscape in the UK. This is not far from Swindon, where I live, and you can see that the landscape is really dominated by fields producing crops. And they're producing important crops like wheat and barley, oilseed rape beans are being grown. But actually, generally, this landscape, a landscape like this, is not that hospitable to pollinators. There's not too many places to nest. There's not too much to forage on when crops aren't in flower. But you'll also notice in this landscape, there's long lines running across this landscape in between all the fields. Now, these are hedgerows. As part of this project, we really wanted to understand, well, these hedgerows potentially provide an important place for pollinators to forage and pollinators to live. How important are they for these species? And not all hedgerows are equal. It was actually National Hedgerow Week last week. I don't know if anybody noticed. So there's a lot of talk on hedgerows and about how important they are at delivering different services like capturing carbon. But what we do know about hedgerows is they're really important habitats for biodiversity. And here's a nice hedgerow with lots of different woody species along it. There's a nice grassy hedge bank you can see as well. So this kind of hedgerow provides a really good habitat for invertebrates, insects, including bees and other pollinators. It's a place to nest and with flowering plants that they can feed on throughout the season. Here's another hedgerow that's perhaps not so good for pollinators. Here you can see there's lots of gaps in this hedgerow. It's quite heavily cut and there aren't too many different plant species in this hedgerow. So this may be less good as a habitat for pollinators, but we wanted to investigate that as part of our research. So for this project, we had three research questions we were interested in. How important are hedgerows for pollinators, but also natural enemies, we call them. So this is another group of insects that are really important for farmers because they help eat crop pests, so like spiders and beetles and insects like that. We also wanted to find out whether good hedges are better than bad hedges in terms of how important they are as habitats for biodiversity, and then whether the local landscape context, so that's, you know, what the land around a hedgerow is like, how that affects how important a hedgerow might be as a habitat. For this study, we worked in four areas. You can see those on the map. So north of Reading, and then 3 other areas up to the north of London. And in each of these blocks, we had 4 hedges that we did our study on, 4 hedgerows. 2 of them were good quality hedgerows. So we thought they were good quality because they had lots of different plant species. They were nice and big, nice and continuous. They didn't have many gaps. But 2 of those hedgerows in each landscape were poorer quality. So they had lots of gaps. They didn't have too many plant species associated with them. And then 2 of those hedgerows were in landscapes that were dominated by agriculture. I suppose that landscape was mostly other crop fields. But then 2 of those hedgerows were in an area which had other hedgerows around. It had other potential habitats for biodiversity, wildlife and invertebrates like woodlands or undisturbed low input grassland as well. And then at each of our study hedgerows, we carried out different survey techniques to try and understand how important these hedgerows were for our invertebrates, including pollinators. So we did pollinator surveys, much like in the other project. We walked along the hedgerow several times through the season, and we counted all the insects we saw visiting flowers along those hedgerows. So we counted how many there were. We looked at how many different species there were as well. And then to try and look at our natural enemies, so our really key insects sort of controlling crop pests that farmers would be interested in, we use pitfall traps. So this other picture shows a pitfall trap. Now these are just a simple plastic cup that you can sort of bury into the ground, and they they capture insects that are crawling along that ground, and they inadvertently fall in to that pitfall trap, and you can come back the next day, lift it out and see what you've collected. And they're really good for looking at numbers of spiders and beetles and other creepy crawlies like that. So we use these techniques in our study. And what we found was that for some species, like spiders and some beetle species, these hedgerows are a really critical habitat. And actually, as you go further into the field, this is what this graph shows, you get less and less of these important invertebrates in the field. So there's many more close to the hedgerow. So this tells us that these insects and these invertebrates are spilling over from those hedgerows into crop fields, where they can carry out that important service of helping control pests on crops like aphids, green flies, and other insects like that. But we also found hedge quality matters as well. We actually got twice as many bumblebees utilising or foraging on these hedgerows that had a greater diversity of plant species, and that were more continuous hedgerows. These were better habitats for our pollinators. We also found greater numbers of spiders on these good quality hedgerows as well. And the hedgerow bank, here we can see a nice hedgerow with a really good amount of different flowering plants growing in that hedgerow bank. And we found this habitat was really critical, particularly for hoverflies. So hoverflies are insects that visit flowers. A lot of adult hoverflies feed on nectar and pollen, and hoverflies are really important species because, as we've seen from the previous project, they're good pollinators of crops, but also the eggs of hoverflies. Hoverflies will lay their eggs on crops, and particularly lay them near collections of green fly, and their larvae of some species are voracious predators of green fly, and so they're called rat-tailed maggots, and they'll crawl around on crops and they'll eat hundreds of green fly. So hoverflies are a really important species in farm landscapes, and we found that this hedge bank was a critical habitat for them. And finally, the last finding on this particular study was that we found if you get more pollinators, more wild bees on hedgerows that are in an area that's dominated by agriculture and farm and crop fields, rather than perhaps in an area where there's other habitats like woodland or low input grassland around, which provide good nesting sites and places to feed for things like bumblebees. We actually found that the numbers of bees were higher on hedges in landscapes surrounded by fields. And this tells us that perhaps these hedgerow habitats are particularly important in intensive agricultural areas where they are really precious habitats for these pollinators, where they're used by pollinators because there's nothing else for them to forage on. So through this project, we really identified how important hedgerows are as a really valuable habitat for pollinators and other biodiversity. And actually, we've got about 500,000 to 700,000 kilometres of hedgerows up and down the UK, so there's quite a lot of them. But actually, many of them aren't those good quality hedgerows that we're looking for. And actually, since the Second World War and increased intensification of agriculture, the number of hedges has really declined across the UK landscape, dropping by around a half since then. So we've really got to work to protect those hedgerows and manage them in a way that makes them the best habitat they can be for these different invertebrates. So finally, I just want to talk about a project we're doing at the moment, and this is continuing to work on our apple orchards down in Kent. So we work with a number of different partners, industry partners, because they're really interested in this kind of research to see how we can manage pollinators, I guess, and improve and maintain crop production, particularly production of high quality apples, despite potential threats that pollinators may be declining locally and regionally. So we're part of a project, the Sustainable Management of Orchard Pollination Services project. And actually in this project, we've been putting in habitat where we're really trying to boost the numbers of these important wild solitary bees, particularly these ground nesting bees that we know make a really important contribution to apple pollination, and that the growers really want to get them into their orchards because they increase the numbers of apples, but also increase the quality of those apples. A well-pollinated apple with lots of seeds is often bigger and a better shape and has more sugar in than other apples. So these pollinators are really important for getting good apples on our apple trees. So the growers are really keen to increase the numbers of these wild bees in their orchards. And we've been trying to do this as part of this project. And actually this picture on the left, you can see we've sown a wildflower plot next to an apple orchard that you can see on the right. So we planted loads of different annuals and mostly perennial flowering species in these flower plots to provide that nectar and pollen to support these wild bees so that they can do that great pollination of those apples. But we also have put in some nesting sites for these ground nesting bees, and actually we've increased the areas of bare ground, particularly in south facing slopes, to see whether we can encourage nesting of these bees, increase their numbers again, make it a better place for them to live in these apple orchards so they can do more pollination of the apples. And encouragingly, we've seen all sorts of different pollinator species visiting these flower plots, landing on the flowers, collecting the nectar and the pollen, and hopefully nesting nearby as well, including some of our ground nesting bees. And actually, we found that the quality of fruit that we're finding in apple orchards that are close to these flower plots is increased. So actually, these flower plots are really helping the wild bee populations and then increasing the fruit quality that we find in these orchards, which is really, really interesting, particularly by increasing numbers of these wild ground nesting bees, these andrenid bees. So that's a couple of projects we've been working on recently, looking at how we might protect pollination and protect pollinators in agricultural landscapes through hedgerow management of hedgerows, or putting in important habitats like flower margins in and around crops. And now I just wanted to touch on a bit of myth busting. Pollinators are often in the news, and there's a lot of headlines about pollinators. It seems to come around pretty frequently. So I just wanted to talk about some potential myth busting and pollinators. And I guess the question is there really a pollinator crisis going on? We hear about this quite often. The short answer is we don't know for sure. So we've got good evidence on the abundance or the kind of the ranges, particularly, of a number of pollinator species, particularly wild bees and some managed pollinators like the honeybee. And we know that some of these aren't doing so well in parts of Europe and North America, where we've got good data on some of these pollinator species. But actually, for most parts of the world, we don't have good data on the abundance and diversity of pollinators, and actually we don't know how well they're doing. I mean, this doesn't mean that numbers might not be declining, But currently we don't know. So is there a pollinator crisis happening? Well, we've got evidence that there's localized declines of some pollinator species in certain parts of the world where we've got good data, but actually we don't know mostly. So it's still an unknown. So that's a target for researchers to try and better understand this. Another thing you hear often about pollinators, I've talked in this presentation about how important pollinators are for supporting, pollinating our crops, for example, and helping us produce the food we eat. But you often hear that maybe it'd be the end of the world if bees disappeared. So if bees went extinct, would human civilization collapse? Well, I mean, certainly if bees and other pollinators disappeared tomorrow, there'd be a lot of negative consequences of that, and it wouldn't be a great situation. And actually some of the fruits and vegetables on which we rely would be much harder to grow. Food would become much more expensive. But actually a lot of the crops we eat, like rice, maize, wheat, so the staple crops that we grow and consume and provide most of our calories, actually these aren't animal pollinated. These are wind or self-pollinated, so they don't need bees or other pollinators to pollinate them. So we could still produce these crops, but actually it's those important nutritious crops like fruits and vegetables that rely more on pollinators, and they'd be much harder to come by. So life would be more difficult without bees and other pollinators, but perhaps humanity wouldn't collapse. Another thing we hear a lot about is pesticides as a negative factor affecting bees and other pollinators. So are pesticides the main threat to pollinators? Well, we've certainly got evidence that pesticides can have a negative effect on pollinators. They can affect their behavior. They can they have sublethal effects. They can also kill them, of course, because they're designed to kill insects. But actually, we've also got good evidence that climate change has a really negative effect on pollinators in different situations as well. And there's real evidence that loss of natural habitats has a major effect on pollinators, as well as these pests and diseases that I also talked about. So there's certainly evidence of pesticides having a negative effect and being a threat to pollinators, but actually there are a number of threats, and it's actually these in combination that affects pollinators mostly. And we often hear about being able to replace bees and other pollinators, perhaps by building robot bees. This often comes up in the news, and there's various ideas about developing robots to do our pollination for us. So is this a pipe dream or a possibility? Well, actually, we're a long way off developing any technology that could pollinate crops and other flowers as well as bees and other pollinators do. They do a great job already, and actually the cost of developing technologies to do this kind of pollination would be astronomical and not an option. So we should work to protect the pollinators we've got rather than try and replace them with the machines and things. So I just want to finish now by talking about what we can do, I suppose, as individuals to help protect pollinators. And actually urban environments where most people live generally are a key habitat for bees and other pollinators. And actually research has shown that there are as many bee species in urban areas as you might find in nature reserves, for example. And that's because of parkland, gardens, hedgerows in urban areas can be a really important habitat. So it's actually Bees Needs Week in July. So this is an event that's run every year, where there's a week of pollinator-focused activities going on with loads of different organisations involved, and Reading will be taking part as well. So you can check out the website for Bees Needs Week. But there are nice 5 simple rules that you can work towards to try and help pollinators yourselves. And that's if you're lucky enough to have a garden, growing more shrubs and trees and flowers in your garden to provide that nectar and pollen throughout the season to support bees and other pollinators is a really good thing to do. And again, if you're lucky enough to have a lawn in your garden, cutting it less often and allowing things like dandelions and daisies to establish and flower in your lawn is a really good thing to do. They provide a really good food resource for bees and other pollinators. And it's nice to have a neat cut lawn, so actually cutting it in sections can be a good thing to do. So some of it short, but you leave some of it long with flowers in. And then letting things grow wild as well. Things like ivy provide a really important food resource for pollinators, particularly at the end of the year. So ivy's in flower in August and September, and if you look at an ivy plant at that time of year, you'll see it's crawling with bees and other pollinators. It's one of the few things that are in flower at that time of year. So if you've got ivy, let it grow. And then this nesting as well for bees is really critical, particularly those ground nesting bees and bumblebees. They like to live in mouse holes and things like that. So leaving undisturbed, messy parts of the garden for bees to nest in and other pollinators to nest in is a really good thing to do. We've talked about the potential impacts of pesticides. So if you're thinking of using them yourself to control some of those pests like aphids and other caterpillars, things like that, then think carefully about using those pesticides because they can be harmful to bees and other pollinators. So I just want to finish now by talking about the pollinator monitoring scheme. So this is another really good way to get involved in pollinators and pollination. So it's a really good way of learning more about pollinators, pollination, getting outside and doing something active, and also it makes a really important contribution to the data that we have on pollinators in the UK. So I showed that study about how some pollinators are declining in the UK. Well, it's gathering this long-term data on the abundance of pollinators that's so important in helping us understand how well they're doing and what we can do to protect them. So everybody can get involved in the pollinator monitoring scheme. And I guess the best way to do this is to take part in the flower insect time counts. And these are where anybody, you don't need any prior experience in pollinators or identifying bees or anything like that. You can get involved. If you visit the website, it's got some really good instructional videos and instructions about how to carry out a FIT count, a flower insect timed count. But basically, it takes about 15 minutes. You'll watch those flowers for about 10 minutes. And any time between April and September, you can carry out these FIT counts. And it's good to do them only on nice, dry, warm days, which is a big advantage, which means you don't have to go out in the rain and do it. You just wait till there's a nice sunny day. You could go into your garden or go to a local park or go to a nature reserve or at the countryside and carry out one of these FIT counts. And you identify some target flowers. There's a good list of 14 different flower species that you're looking for on the website. But it's really common stuff like dandelions and blackthorn and things like that you can hawthorn, that you can spot and do your pollinator count on. The idea is you watch an area of those flowering plants for 10 minutes and count all the different flower visiting insects you see, and you can take photos of them and upload them as well. And there's some really good ID guides, so identification guides that will teach you how to tell the difference between a bee and a wasp and a fly and a beetle, for example. So they're really useful, and then you can have a practice whilst you do your FIT count. And then you can submit your results to the POMS monitoring scheme, and your data will be join data being collected by loads of people up and down the country, and provides a really valuable data source to tell us more about pollinators and how well they're doing. And actually there's a new app now that you can download to carry out these FIT counts, which is really user friendly, and that helps you carry out those FIT counts and record the data and helps you keep time while you're doing that pollinator survey as well. So definitely visit the website, the POMS Pollinator Monitoring Scheme. It's led by the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and Claire Carvel's coordinating the project. And you know, they're really keen to get loads of people out there carrying out these FIT counts. So I'd just like to finish by thanking colleagues at the University of Reading and elsewhere who helped with these research projects that I've been talking about, and of course the farmers who always let us carry out research on their land and are really supportive of the projects we're doing. And I'd like to thank Trees and the Friends of Marden Valley for inviting me to talk to you as well. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have, and I hope I haven't overrun too much.
Mike, thank you very much indeed. You absolutely haven't. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And I have to say, as a complete amateur on all of these subjects, it's been absolutely fascinating hearing you and indeed other colleagues over the past few weeks. So thank you very much indeed. Really stimulating, challenging in parts, but optimistic at the same time. So yes, questions, please.
Ian, can we have the slide taken down, please? Can Mike take the slide down? Oh, thank you.
I think John Bennett has got his hand up first. John, fire away, please.
Hello. You had your wildflowers planted upside the orchard. Can wildflowers not be grown in an orchard amongst the trees and do the same job, or does it have to be to the side?
No, it doesn't have to be at the side. So we've had projects as well where we've been growing different plant species in the alleyways themselves, so between the apple trees, and you can establish flowers there, and they can be important at providing nectar and pollen for pollinators as well. And there's research elsewhere that's shown that that really does deliver benefits as well. We were working with our growers, and we decided so we could plant the kind of diversity of species we were looking for and manage them in a way they take you've got to kind of mow them at the right time and control certain weeds and things to really establish a nice flower margin. We were working with our growers and decided to set them up at the side of the orchard. So we found orchards where there was a nice patch of land that we could use next to the orchard to set up our flower plots. But certainly, yeah, a lot of growers will be encouraging flowering plants in their alleyways as well, particularly things that are there anyway, like dandelions and things. If you don't mow it too often, you can let those dandelions establish between the apple trees. And we've seen, you know, these ground nesting solitary bees really getting in to those dandelion flowers to feed on nectar and pollen. So yeah, both are definitely an option.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Any more questions? Other questions, please? Clicking across from screen to screen. I'm going to bring John in a second, but I think Adrian's using the correct technology. So Adrian, I'm going to ask you to come in first, please.
Hi there. I've got a question for Mike. Do you know of any studies that have looked at the effects on pollinators of the downstream output from incinerators in the UK?
Short answer, no. I'm afraid I haven't. So what would be what would be the likely impact of that, do you think? I mean, I mean, indirectly, I might have some ideas of research that might be relevant, but directly, I'm not aware of any. No.
Yes, it's the small particle sizes, the PM below PM10, getting stuck on their wings and on their bodies and in their sporacles, and generally toxifying them and killing them.
Yeah. Okay. Well. So I know of research, and we're actually doing some at Reading. A colleague called Robbie Girling at the University of Reading is looking at the effects of diesel particulates on pollinators. So there's currently research to see what the impacts of these things are. So yeah, if you look up Robbie Girling's research, and if you can drop me an email as well, and I can send you some stuff he's done if that would help. But that yeah, so people are looking at the effects of these pollutants on pollinators, and effects are emerging, unsurprisingly.
Okay.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to go back to John Bennett for a second bite, and then to Robert McNaughton. You're on mute.
Sorry, yeah, I know. Sorry. You've got a few on the chat as well, questions on the chat, I think. But sorry, the holes, the little bees that live in holes, is there any way we can replicate that sort of environment? Is it a particularly sandy environment, or because around here it's mostly thick, heavy clay on top of very heavy rock?
Yeah. So you're asking all the right questions, John, because we're asking the same questions of ourselves as well. It's like, could we create something where we could kind of bring in some nesting habitat that was really good for these ground nesting bees. So we have a PhD student currently, Konstantinos, working on trying to set up pallets full of substrates at different densities and made up of different components to see whether we can encourage ground nesting bees. And he's making really good headway in understanding what it is about these different sites that makes them really popular for these ground nesting bees. But actually it's not quite so simple. We thought, you know, if you clear the vegetation away of an area and it's got good sun exposure in the morning, and it's made up of similar soil to another patch where there's loads of bees nesting, you know, bees would come and nest there. But actually they don't always. So there's some interesting factors that seem to be determining whether these bees nest there or not, and it's perhaps not just down to the substrate itself. So we're doing research on that at the moment. For our project in apple orchards, we did clear vegetation and we did increase the amount of nesting happening there, but we didn't always see big aggregations of bees, which would be really good to get there. So yeah, it's trying to pin down what factors determine whether they nest in a place or not. And it's not just down to the substrate, but yeah, we're looking into it. It'd be great if we could discover what that was.
Thank you.
Sounds like a research project for John Bennett, perhaps. I don't know. But, moving on, I'm going to come to the chat questions in a second, but moving on to Robert McNaughton.
Hi, Mike. I loved what you talk. I thought it was fantastic what you were saying. I learned such a lot. You alluded to the export of pollinators to other countries and, of course, the negative effect they'd have on the native species. Can you elaborate on that, please? Are apple growers in South America importing bees, or how does that work?
So they are. You can buy colonies of bees, and Bombus terrestris is one of them. Predominantly, and they should only be used or predominantly used in protected cultivation, so in glass houses and polytunnels and things like that, particularly to pollinate tomatoes and strawberries and other crops like that. So clearly some have escaped and established themselves. And South America is a place where they were non-native, but they're similar to some native species, and therefore they present a potential competitor. And there's been declines of some of the native bumblebee species, or a native bumblebee species, particularly in southern South America. It seems to correlate with the expansion of Bombus terrestris, one of these bumblebee species. So there's a potential link there that it may be due to that, or that may be a factor, but there could be a number of other reasons why that's happening. But yeah, they're moved around a lot and used for pollination. I mean, they're important for that pollination. They increase yields and crop quality, but that movement of species between countries comes with a number of kind of risks associated with it, and moving diseases between different species as well as a potential risk of doing that. Yeah.
So would you be trying to stop that, or you?
I mean, I know in terms of the legislation on what you can import and when, there are rules that are in place and restrictions in place to try and reduce those threats. I don't know exactly what they are, but clearly in some contexts, maybe they're not working well enough, or there has been some negative impacts of moving these species around. So it would need a careful consideration, I think, about what exactly you need to do to avoid these potential risks of disease transmission between these managed bee species and wild bee species, or displacement of local populations, and changing the genetic diversity of local populations as well, if some of these bee species that have been moving around will escape and establish. So it definitely needs some careful thought to avoid these things. And I know there's legislation in place. I don't even know exactly what that is, but it's predominantly using them in protected cultivation. Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. I'll just leave you with two words: Japanese knotweed. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Sticking with the issue of importing bees, I've got a question from Fiona, or from her iPad, which is, what happens to the imported bees once they've done the job of pollinating?
You'd need to dispose of them after they've done their job of pollinating. So they have queen restrictors on them generally, so they may start to try and reproduce and produce new queens, but it's better if they don't escape. So they're restricted, and then you've got to dispose of them. So if you buy these bees for pollination, you've got to dispose of them. So yeah, it's kind of a one use item, I think, these bumblebee boxes.
Gosh, no recycling then. So, right, I'm just going to head back now. A couple of questions from Julia in the early part of the evening in terms of pollinators, and that is whether moths can play any role, or do play any role, in pollinating crops. Is that part of the other, perhaps?
So moths definitely are pollinators, and for some species they're specially adapted to be pollinated only by some moth species. So moths can be really important pollinators. In our surveys, when we surveyed those crops up and down the country, we've worked in other crops as well, like raspberries, cherries. We have rarely seen moths visiting flowers. So I would say for crop pollinators, particularly in this country, moths are probably not one of the main pollinators. They're probably an infrequent pollinator. Although at night, there's a potential that they may be visiting more flowers at night and potentially contributing to pollination then. But I think in crops, it's less likely, I think. Okay. So in certain contexts and for certain species, moths are really important pollinators. I think not so much in crops, particularly in the UK.
Thank you, Mike. A second one from Julia. Do you think, in terms of the analysis of hedgerows, would there be any manifest or any major difference between the rural hedgerows that you're looking at and urban hedgerows? I mean, would there be less pesticides, but perhaps more pollution?
Yeah, I mean, hedgerows are different up and down the country, and different parts of the country. Hedgerows are really different. The species that are being grown, the way the plant species, you know, hedgerow species that are being grown, the way they're managed, it varies a lot. And that would be the same for urban areas as well. I think the kind of what makes a good hedgerow, so the kind of basic rules of hedgerows, I think would be quite similar actually. If we're thinking about how important they are as a kind of habitat for invertebrates, then the kind of basic rules for a rural hedgerow and urban hedgerow, I think, would be the same. It's getting lots of different species, plant species in that hedgerow. So it provides lots of different niches and habitats for different invertebrates, particularly, say, pollinators. You're looking for things that flower at different times. So getting those into the hedgerow is a good thing, both in rural and urban areas. And also protecting that hedge bank. So in agricultural areas, you'll often have a buffer strip between the field and the hedgerow itself, which is good, but they won't necessarily spray and they won't plough up. And that hedgerow bank can be really important, as we saw for the hoverfly species. But that would be the same in urban hedgerows. Actually, you don't want to cut that grass right up to the hedgerow. You don't want to weed underneath the hedgerow. I think leaving all that diversity there is a really good thing. So that's the same again for rural and urban hedgerows. And then it's the way they're managed and cut. So actually not cutting them too much, so you get a nice big hedgerow, and cutting them at the right time of year is really important too. So cutting them in winter, particularly when maybe they're not likely to be flowering, to provide that important floral resource for pollinators and other animals, but also not in the autumn when they provide lots of food for birds. So that cutting at the right time, not cutting too often as well, and that's the same for both rural and urban hedgerows. But yeah, maybe they're exposed to fewer agrochemicals perhaps in urban areas, and actually there's evidence showing that hedgerows are really key at actually capturing that particulate matter in air pollution. So they deliver that benefit as well as potentially being a habitat. But of course that might bring wildlife that's utilizing that hedgerow into contact with that pollution as well, potentially. But yeah, I think good hedgerows are good hedgerow.
Thank you, Mike. I've got a question from Jackie regarding the whole programme, of course, of trees for carbon capture. What are the best trees to persuade people to plant or encourage the planting and the activity around pollinators? What will attract pollinators to trees, Mike?
Yeah, again, so there's loads of different trees that flower and provide important nectar and pollen. I mean, definitely hawthorn and blackthorn in hedgerows are a really good thing to plant, particularly because they produce flowers at the beginning of the season. So those pollinators that come out early in the spring, they provide really important nectar and pollen there. There's not too much flowering then through the summer is generally okay, and it's good to get a number of different species that will flower through the summer into the hedgerow. But particularly at the end, as I was saying, ivy is a really important flower, and so letting ivy establish in a hedgerow, not to the point where it affects the growth of those other hedgerow species, but having ivy in those hedgerows sort of bookends that season. So you've got those early flowering hawthorns, blackthorns, and then those late flowering ivy in your hedgerow. I think getting those in there is a really good thing to do. And focusing on kind of native species, I think, in hedgerows is a good thing to do.
Thank you, Mike. Are there any, I feel as I should be making notes actually. I often feel like that in these presentations. There's so much to learn, most of which I shall forget if I don't write it down. But are there any other questions for Mike before we let him sit and relax in Sweden? I think we're done, Mike. I have to say, Mike, one of the best signs from a Zoom meeting is the number of people that started the meeting and the number of people that finished that didn't leave. And I have to say, all of these meetings, and yours included, virtually nobody has left. So I think that's a tremendous tribute to you. I've got actually another question, another message has come in from Fiona, if you wouldn't mind, Mike, which is what happened?
Yeah.
What happened? Oh, no, there's another question, and I'm asking you the same question. Oh, right, yes, it's actually thanks to me. I made the question sound quite eloquent, says Julia. Great answer to Mike. Thank you. A great talk. Well, I think on that note, what more can I say? But Mike, thank you very much indeed. Thanks everybody for joining us. Particular thanks to Susan, who did all the hard work in terms of setting up the meeting. But thanks to everybody for participating. Let's hope to hear more from you, Mike, in the future. Yes, quite rightly, we do a sort of one of those Zoom rounds of applause, perhaps, for Mike and Susan as well. And can I also thank Robert McNaughton, who does a huge amount behind the scenes to get these gatherings together. So thanks to Robert as well. So thank you again, Mike. Sincere good luck with everything you're doing. It really is tremendously important, and hope to see everybody else in the not too distant future. Thank you very much and good evening.